Today at the National Press Club, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. Since leaving politics, he's resumed his business career and is a regular commentator on issues including climate change and geopolitics. Malcolm Turnbull with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club Westpac address. I'm the club's president, Laura Tingle. Because of continuing lockdowns, I'm welcoming you from the ABC studios in Canberra, and our guest today, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, is speaking to us from the ABC studios in Sydney. Mr Turnbull was Prime Minister when the deal with the French to build conventionally powered versions of their submarines was signed, and is perhaps unsurprisingly a critic of the way the deal was dumped when Australia announced a couple of weeks ago its new alliance with the United States and the United Kingdom with the aim of Australia gaining a nuclear-powered submarine fleet. He was also famously undone twice as party leader over his attempts to embrace policies to substantially reduce carbon emissions. So his appearance today, his 15th, could not be more timely. Malcolm Turnbull, welcome to the virtual National Press Club.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. It's great to be with you all, albeit virtually. With the swirl of media soundbites, the impression has been created that the Australian government has replaced a diesel-electric French-designed submarine for a nuclear-powered American or British one. This is not the case. Australia now has no new submarine program at all. We've cancelled the one we had with France, and we have a statement of intent with the UK and the United States to examine the prospect of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. Over the next 18 months, there will be a review of the possibilities. The biggest probably being whether the new submarine should be based on the UK Astute submarine or the larger American Virginia class. The hyperbole around the new AUKUS partnership has been dialed up to 11. No three nations in the world already have closer security, intelligence and technology collaboration than Australia, the US and the UK. And it's been getting closer in recent years. As Canada's Justin Trudeau observed, this is all about selling submarines to Australia. The Australian government has chosen to terminate a contract with France's largely state-owned naval group to build 12 attack-class submarines. While based on the design of France's latest nuclear sub, they were to be conventionally powered, a modification stipulated by Australia in the competitive tender process that began in 2015 and concluded in April 2016, when it was approved by my government's National Security Committee, of which the current Prime Minister, Defence Minister and Foreign Minister were all members. But nothing is agreed. There's no design, no costing, no contract. The only certainty is that we won't have new submarines for 20 years, and their cost will be a lot more than the French-designed subs. However, high hopes and good intentions are in abundance, but there were plenty of them when we did the deal with France too. The first of the attack-class submarines was to be in the water by 2032, with the rest of the fleet coming out of the shipyards every 2 years until the full complement had been constructed. It was the largest defence procurement in our history, a partnership of generations between France and Australia. However, the nagging concern about the French submarines was that they were not nuclear-powered. Nuclear-powered subs have unlimited underwater range. Nuclear reactors, unlike diesel engines, do not need oxygen. Their endurance is only limited by the need to keep the crew sustained. They can operate at much higher, sustained speeds underwater, about 25 knots, than a diesel-electric submarine can, and they don't need to surface or snort to recharge their batteries by running their diesel motors. So, given the long distances our submarines have to travel and our vast maritime domain, why did Australia decide not to order nuclear-powered submarines? The answer is, or was, that we do not have, and by law are not able to have, a civil nuclear industry which is needed to support the maintenance of a nuclear navy. There is no country with a nuclear navy that does not also have a civil nuclear industry. Now, the choice of a conventional submarine had been made long before I became Prime Minister, and the competitive tender was well underway. This determination was confirmed to us on numerous occasions, not just by our own Navy, but by the expert advisory board chaired by Don Winter, an engineer and former US Secretary of the Navy, and which included 3 US Navy admirals with direct command and engineering experience in nuclear submarines. There were 3 bids from France, Japan and Germany. It was my government which chose the French bid on the basis that it was the best, especially in terms of stealthiness, which is the prime requirement for a submarine. Now, as I said earlier, the current PM, Foreign Minister and Defence Minister were all members of that National Security Committee. So there's been a lot of continuity in the personnel, apart from myself, of course. Now, in 2018, I tasked the Defence Department to formally reconsider the potential for nuclear-powered submarines in Australia. Technologies were changing, the risk environment was worsening. I was concerned that conventionally powered boats would not be good enough in the future. The big question, however, remained whether we could sustain and maintain a nuclear-powered Navy in Australia without local Australian nuclear facilities, and the advice remained that we could not. Leaving aside the politics, it was plain enough that we did not need a civil nuclear industry to generate electricity. It's very clear today that the cheapest forms of new generation are renewables backed by storage, batteries or pumped hydro. So any local nuclear industry would have to have as its overwhelming justification the support of a nuclear navy. The alternative, I was advised, would have been to have a nuclear-powered submarine that required maintenance in another country. This would have meant our submarine capability was not sovereign. If you can't maintain your own ships, you are not in full control of them. Now, one of the attractions of the French design was that these submarines were originally designed for nuclear propulsion. They are, in fact, France's latest nuclear submarine model, class. So if we had decided to switch to nuclear, we had a partner that had the expertise to do it with us, whereas Japan and Germany obviously did not. Now, in its natural state, uranium is 99% made up of a stable isotope, U-238. The unstable radioactive isotope, U-235, is only about 0.7%. The more U-235, the more radiation, reactivity and energy. Highly enriched uranium, HEU, has a concentration of 20% or more U-235. Low enriched uranium, as used in nuclear power stations, is typically between 2 and 5%. That's why there is enormous concern in terms of proliferation about uranium enrichment, because the more it's enriched, the more it can be used in weapons. Now, the US, UK and Russia are the only countries still to use highly enriched uranium in their naval reactors. It's enriched up into the 90s, about 95%, and it is in fact drawn from stockpiles that were built up for nuclear weapons. So it is absolutely weapons-grade uranium. Now, for Australia, a non-nuclear weapons state, using highly enriched uranium in a submarine is not a breach of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation, but it does set a precedent which other currently non-nuclear weapons states, like Iran, will seek to exploit as a justification for producing highly enriched uranium. Now, following the AUKUS announcement, I was advised by the government that the work that I had commenced back in 2018 on nuclear options had continued, and it had been concluded now that Australia could use the modular, highly enriched uranium reactors currently deployed in the UK Astute and US Virginia class submarines, which, because of their weapons-grade fuel, do not require replacement during the 35-year life of the submarine. This, it is contended, means that Australia could have a nuclear-powered submarine without any need to maintain, service or refuel the nuclear reactor. Now, this is very different advice to that given to the government as recently as 3 years ago, and it sounds too good to be true. Australia would have submarines powered by nuclear reactors, running on weapons-grade uranium, and we would not need to have any of our own nuclear facilities or expertise? Is it credible to have a hands-off, plug-and-play nuclear reactor filled with weapons-grade uranium and not inspect it for 35 years? Well, the US and the UK will know for sure in about 30 years. And until then, if something does go wrong, both nations have extensive nuclear facilities and expertise to deal with it. Australia does not. The French nuclear propulsion system, however, uses low-enriched uranium, somewhat more enriched than that used in civil nuclear plants, power plants. By law, they inspect their reactors and refuel them every 10 years. All submarines go in for a lengthy year or more refit every decade. And the refuelling of the French naval reactor takes a few weeks of that lengthy exercise. In this regard, at least, French naval nuclear reactor safety standards are stricter than those applied in the United States and the United Kingdom. The new AUKUS submarines, we're told, will still be built in Adelaide. But if there are no nuclear facilities there, that must mean the submarine hulls will be transported to the United States or the UK to have the reactor installed together with all of the other safety and systems connected to it. Now, you don't need to be especially cynical to see it won't be long before someone argues it looks much simpler to have the first submarine built in the US or the UK, and then the second, third, and so on. Australia is the first country to receive access to US naval reactors since the original technology transfer to the UK in 1958. But the UK was and remains a nuclear weapons state with a substantial civil nuclear industry. Australia will be the first country without any civil nuclear industry to operate a nuclear submarine and the first non-nuclear weapons state to use highly enriched uranium in a naval reactor. So if we are not going to develop nuclear facilities of our own, as Mr Morrison has promised, then we will be no more sharing nuclear technology with the United States than the owner of an iPhone is sharing smartphone technology with Apple. A new submarine under the new AUKUS arrangement would not be in the water until 2040, we're told. That is about 8 years after the first attack-class submarine would have been in service. So we are now without any new submarines for the best part of 20 years. In the meantime, the Collins-class submarines are going to be refitted so they can last another decade. Let's hope that works well. But it doesn't get us to 2040. So whichever way you look at this, there is going to be an even bigger capability gap. For several years now, the attack-class submarine program has been accused of cost blowouts from $50 to $90 billion. The $50 billion was the estimate of the cost of the total program in 2016 dollars, and that included the Lockheed Martin combat and weapons system, the construction of a new dockyard in Adelaide, and many items unrelated or unprovided by the Naval Group. The $90 billion figure is no more than the estimated cost of the project in nominal dollars over its 35-year life. It's a rough estimate based on assumptions about inflation, exchange rates, and technologies over the decades. Now, this cost blowout, the falsity of it, this canard, if I can use a French term, this was allowed to run without being corrected by the Australian government. Virtually every single newspaper article, media article about this program has said there's been a cost blowout. It was never corrected by the government that commissioned the submarines. Of course, now that the flurry of the media announcement is over, the question remains whether we'll be able to negotiate a satisfactory deal with the United States and the UK to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine for Australia. If this Astute is preferred because of its size, then for practical purposes, we will be price takers. Tony Abbott was of the view that Australia could not build the new diesel-electric submarines itself. And his original plan was that they would be built in Japan. With the support of my colleagues, I determined that all of the submarines should be built in Australia. This was to be the biggest element in a new, continuous, sovereign shipbuilding industry in Australia. Itself an engine of innovation, science and technology, with enormous spillover benefits to the rest of the economy. How can we maintain that commitment without having the nuclear facilities in Australia to enable maintenance and support of the new submarine's reactor and connected systems? Now, if this is where we are heading, and I believe it should be, then a reactor fuelled with low enriched uranium is safer in every respect than one fuelled with highly enriched uranium. Nonetheless, in 2040, if we do have the first of a nuclear-powered submarine fleet, that would be a good development, in that the submarine would have range and capabilities a diesel-electric boat does not. But the way we are getting there has been clumsy, deceitful and costly. Too many questions are not being asked and fewer answered. The blustering attempts to wedge those who seek answers do not serve our national interest. Our national security does not rely on fleets and armies alone, and that's just as well, for we'll never have the military might to match that of potential rivals. Echoing our 2017 Foreign Affairs White Paper, as Maurice Payne said on Monday, and I quote, "Australia is respected when we engage with the region honestly and consistently." Diplomacy matters. And at the heart of diplomacy is trust. Australia's reputation as a trusted and reliable partner has been an enormous asset to us on the international stage, just as a trustworthy reputation is an enormous asset to someone in business. Now, some of you may have read the transcript, fairly accurate, of my notorious phone call with Donald Trump in January 2017, in which I persuaded him to stick to the refugee resettlement deal I'd struck with President Obama. My argument was that America had given its word and he should stick to it. When he suggested I had broken agreements in my business life, I said I had not. Furious he may have been, but Trump did not renege on that deal. Imagine if he'd been able to say, "Hey, how about the time you double-crossed the French?" It was only a few years ago that our partnership with France was to be one for generations. As the sun set over Sydney Harbour in March 2018, from the deck of HMAS Canberra, President Emmanuel Macron described the partnership with Australia as the cornerstone of France's Indo-Pacific strategy. This was not just a contract to build submarines. It was a partnership between two nations in which France chose to entrust Australia with its most sensitive military secrets, the design of their latest submarines. France is an Indo-Pacific power, with 2 million citizens and 7,000 troops across the two oceans. Drawing closer to France as a security partner made enormous sense, both for us and indeed the United States. France is the world's sixth and the EU's second largest economy, a permanent member of the Security Council, a nuclear weapons state with its own nuclear technology for energy, naval propulsion and weapons. With Angela Merkel's retirement, Macron will be the most influential of the EU leaders. Always inclined to protectionism historically, France became a strong supporter of our bid for a free trade agreement with the EU, invited Australia for the first time to the G7, and aligned its Indo-Pacific strategy and ultimately that of the European Union to ours. Mr Morrison has not acted in good faith. He deliberately deceived France. He makes no defence of his conduct other than to say it was in Australia's national interest. So is that Mr Morrison's ethical standard with which Australia is now tagged? Australia will act honestly unless it's judged in our national interest to deceive. It was as recently as 30 August that our defence and foreign ministers met with their French counterparts and publicly re-emphasised the importance of the submarine program. 2 weeks later, on the day Mr Morrison dumped the President of France with a text message, the Department of Defence formally advised Naval Group that the project was on track and ready to enter into the next set of contracts. The media has been gleefully briefed that Mr Morrison struck the deal with Boris Johnson and Joe Biden at the G20 in July, shortly before going to Paris, where our Prime Minister confirmed to President Macron his continuing commitment to the submarine deal. France's Foreign Minister has described Australia's conduct as a stab in the back, a betrayal. President Macron has recalled his ambassadors to Canberra and Washington. Dan Tehan can't get a meeting with the French Trade Minister any more than he can with the Chinese Trade Minister. France's Europe Minister has already poured cold water on the prospects of concluding an EU-Australian free trade agreement. Australia has proved it can't be trusted, he has said. France believes it has been deceived and humiliated, and she was. This betrayal of trust will dog our relations with Europe for years. The Australian government has treated the French Republic with contempt. It won't be forgotten. Every time we seek to persuade another nation to trust us, somebody will be saying, remember what they did to Macron? If they can throw France under a bus, what would they do to us? So, what should have been done? The conventional nuclear debate was hardly news. Morrison could have told the truth. Yes, he could. He could have done that. He could have told the truth. He could have said to President Macron that we wanted to explore the potential for acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. Macron would have been supportive. The French government had already invited such a discussion. The Americans, who were supplying the weapons system, Lockheed Martin, should have been engaged. President Biden has acknowledged that this exercise has been mishandled and that there should have been, and I quote, open consultation among allies on matters of strategic interest to France and our European partners. Now, if after that honest discussion it had been concluded that we could not use a French reactor, the inclusion of a US or UK reactor could have been considered. Let's assume that after that discussion, the conclusion was that only a US or UK submarine with a weapons-grade naval reactor would do. Let's assume that. If the contract with France was terminated at that point, nobody could say Australia had been dishonest or sneaky. France would be disappointed, but not betrayed, disrespected or humiliated. Mr Morrison's response is to say that he could not be open and honest with President Macron because the French might have run to Washington and urged President Biden not to do the deal. That tells you a lot about how confident he is about the commitment of the Americans. As Paul Kelly records, with approbation, Scott Morrison deliberately and elaborately set out to persuade the French that their deal was on foot and proceeding until he knew he had an alternative deal, whereupon he dumped the French and his deceitful conduct was exposed. Now, despite this awkward birth, I hope that AUKUS turns out to be a success, a great success. It should be. We are already the closest of friends and allies and none closer. As Prime Minister, I argued we should not see our region, or the world, as a series of spokes connected to Washington or Beijing, but rather as a mesh where nations like Australia would build their security by stronger ties with all our neighbours, great and small. This approach delivered a much stronger relationship with Indonesia, including a free trade agreement, and indeed with most nations of ASEAN. It secured in 2017 a commitment from the 4 leaders to revive the quadrilateral dialogue between India, Japan, Australia and the USA. In the same year, with Shinzo Abe, we were able to defy the doubters at home and abroad and conclude the Trans-Pacific Partnership without the United States. Throughout this time and since, our security alliance and cooperation with the United States became stronger and more intense. But we always made our own decisions. Of course, our rivals and critics have said Australia will always fall in with the US. Years ago, I remember the foreign minister of one of our neighbours said to me, if Australia is just seen as a branch office of the US, why should we take much time with you? Better to talk direct to head office. Now, if we want to have influence in our region, we must be trusted. Our word must be our bond. We must be seen to have an independent foreign policy and sovereign defence capabilities. We need to have, develop and retain relations with other nations in our region and beyond, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which are not simply derivatives of our alliance with the United States. And at the heart of all of this is trust. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mr. Turnbull. If we could just open towards the end of your commentary, which is about the relationship with France. I wonder, given that you obviously formed a very warm relationship with Emmanuel Macron at the time of the signing of the contract and afterwards, have you been able to speak to him since the announcement of AUKUS? What was his take on what communications had been made by the Australian government and particularly by the Prime Minister? What do you think he sees as the implications of the Australian action? There's been a suggestion that France just sees it as a commercial deal rather than as a strategic one. And how should we seek to fix the relationship with France?
Well, Laura, I guess I have spoken to Emmanuel Macron. He is a friend, and I've stayed in touch with him since I left office. He's one of the great leaders of our times, an enormously important figure in global politics and, of course, particularly in Europe. Look, I'm not going to, quote him, but what you've heard from the French government is held. Those are views held right across the board. I mean, there is nobody in France that I'm aware of saying, "Oh, this is just another commercial deal. Too bad." Not at all. I mean, Jean-Yves Le Drian, the foreign minister, when he said it was a stab in the back, was not speaking just for himself. There is outrage, absolute outrage, because what it tells you is that Australia can't be trusted. You see, with Scott Morrison, when he does something that is criticised as being slippery or disingenuous or dissembling in domestic politics, and of course that does happen from time to time, and your members no doubt draw that to the public's attention. It reflects on him, it reflects on the government, but when you do that, when you conduct yourself in such a deceitful manner internationally, it has a real impact on Australia. An Australian Prime Minister is always representing Australia, but at home, people see him or her as representing his or her government, political party, or whatever. But on the international stage, the Prime Minister of the day is Australia, and his or her conduct is much more consequential. And that is why dealing in good faith, being honest, being open, look, honestly, we have a massive interest in this. I mean, what seems to have been overlooked is that one of our national security assets is trustworthiness. And Mr. Morrison has behaved clearly. I mean, he doesn't even argue with it. His acolytes and admirers have since praising him for his clever sneakiness. I mean, this is an appalling episode in Australia's international affairs, and the consequences of it will endure to our disadvantage for a very long time.
The next question is from Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan from The Conversation. Mr. Turnbull, can I move you on to another issue which involves both defence and a contract? The government is at the moment reviewing the contract that the Chinese have for the port of Darwin. Do you think that, given the different security situation that now operates compared to when that contract was given, the government should override it?
Look, I think the government should tread very carefully there. There was at the time, I mean, and this decision was taken literally just before I became Prime Minister, so it was something I inherited. But the advice from Defence, Dennis Richardson, from ASIO, all of the national security agencies, was that this was a transaction that the federal government should not seek to hold up or interfere with. I think that there are other assets in Australia, I would have to say, held by Chinese state-owned companies, which are, particularly in the electricity sector, which are arguably more sensitive than the Darwin port lease. So, we've got to be very careful to be seen as a trusted, reliable partner, and I think going back in time and trying to break a lease, and that would not be legally straightforward, would be it could open up a whole Pandora's box of problems that might that probably could be best avoided. I think I dealt with this in my book, as you know. We went through, after the Darwin port issue and then after the Ausgrid issue, Scott Morrison and I, in fact, set up a critical infrastructure register. There wasn't really a good understanding in the federal government of what was critical infrastructure. So there's a much better mechanism to manage these things now. But I think going back and undoing deals that have been done is something you want to think very, very carefully about.
The next question is from Fiona Willan.
Mr Turnbull, it's Fiona Willan here from 9 News. Thank you for taking my question. You have been a relentless critic of this government since you left office. Do you think Australia would be better off under Anthony Albanese?
Look, I won't buy into that, but that'll be a matter for the Australian people in months to come.
The next question is from Catherine Murphy, and just while we're lining up the Zoom for Catherine, if I could just ask Mr Turnbull, one of the major points of your speech was about the credibility of being able to run a nuclear fleet without industry here in Australia. What do you think the implications of that are in terms of why the government has made this change? I mean, it seems like you're saying the advice was that we couldn't maintain a nuclear-powered navy without Australian nuclear industries just a couple of years ago. What's changed, and what would have to change?
Well, what the government is saying is that these modular, highly enriched uranium reactors, naval reactors that are being used in the Virginia class and the Astute class in the UK, are ones that they're called life of ship. LOS, and they don't need to be refuelled during the 35-year life of the ship. And this sort of breezy assurance sort of suggests that a naval nuclear reactor powered with weapons-grade uranium is something like a battery that you might pick up at Bunnings for your, Makita, power tool set. And then when the battery's, finished, you send it back, or something like that.
You're essentially saying there's no credibility.
Look, literally nobody runs naval propulsion with highly enriched uranium apart from the UK, US and Russia. And all three countries have got extensive nuclear experience, facilities, and of course are nuclear weapons states, which is where the highly enriched uranium comes from. I mean, there has in fact been, a movement, a very strong argument in the scientific and particularly among the non-proliferation community in the US, to say that the Americans should move to low enriched uranium, as the French have done. The US Navy says, no, we're fine, we can manage it, and it gives us more power without refueling. And look, that's a sort of a debate for them, but they have had accidents. The British have had accidents. The bottom line is that we are literally walking into the most potentially dangerous form of nuclear naval propulsion at a time when we have no civil, let alone naval, nuclear expertise in Australia. And that is a fact. And at the same time, Mr Morrison says, oh, don't worry, we won't have to have any nuclear industry, you don't have to worry about that. I mean, this is, as I said, it was fine in the swirl of sound bites. But when you look at it, you have to say that a responsible government would have had an honest and open discussion with our partner, France. Maybe we should have built the first 3 submarines with diesel electric propulsion and then moved to low enriched uranium later, for the balance of the fleet. I mean, the fact that there was no discussion and this extraordinary subterfuge and deceit that was practiced, it has left us with so many unresolved questions. And anyone who questions it, such as those unfortunate members of the Labor Party who question it, are essentially accused of being unpatriotic. Well, look, I can say this to you. I'm not getting any lectures on patriotism from Scott Morrison, right? I defended the national security of this country and its national interest. And I know the way that he has behaved is putting that at risk.
Catherine Murphy has a question.
Thanks, Laura. Hello, Mr Turnbull. Liberals will face challenges from a number of climate-focused independents at the next federal election. In a recent New South Wales contest, you endorsed an independent. Are you likely to do the same in the federal election if your former colleagues don't produce a climate change policy ahead of the COP26 in Glasgow with sufficient ambition?
Well, I haven't made a decision about that. I mean, I remain a member of the Liberal Party. The independent I endorsed in the Upper Hunter by-election, Kirsty O'Connell, was running against a National Party candidate. And despite the indignation of Mr Barilaro, there's nothing in the Liberal Party rules that says you've got to support the National Party. Certainly nothing in the National Party rules that says you've got to support the Liberal Party, as we all know. So no, I'll wait and see. But I reserve my rights, as they would say.
Phil Curry from the Financial Review.
Hi, Mr Turnbull. Phil Curry from the Financial Review. Just in follow-up to Catherine's question, some of those people that do face a challenge at the election time, people like Trent Zimmerman and Dave Sharma in your old seat of Wentworth, those people sort of voted for you, went to the wire for you in terms of the leadership. A couple of things. Do you feel any loyalty to them, given they're sort of still carrying the baton inside the Federal Liberal Party for climate change? And do you think climate change policy can be enforced using independence in a hung parliament? What's the better mechanism? Change from within or forcing it from without?
Well, look, the three members that you mentioned, Jason, Trent and Dave, are all friends of mine. And Dave obviously wasn't in the parliament when I was there, but look, they're definitely moderates, they're progressive, but they are not. So the move to vote them out is not going to be based on the fact that they are climate change denialists or right-wing nutjobs. The argument would be that because of the way the Liberal Party and the coalition generally has swung to the right, they are not able, their voice is not being taken into account. But look, I'm not in politics anymore. Obviously as a citizen, former PM, I speak about issues like that, but apart from the Upper Hunter by-election, I have not got myself involved in electoral politics since I left Parliament, and it's quite likely I'll remain in that disengaged situation.
Richard Ferguson has a question.
Richard Ferguson from The Australian. Thank you for your speech, Mr Turnbull. You've just said that the next election will be a matter for the Australian people, but like everyone, you have a personal vote. Will you personally vote for the Liberal Party at the next election?
Richard, it's been a long habit, but it's also been it's a secret ballot. So again, that will be a matter between me and the ballot box. If I could just come back to subs for a moment. I just wondered, you've talked about how, and others have talked about the fact that there's going to be a 20-year gap, essentially, before we see these submarines, if we do see them. What are the pinch points going to be in terms of where our sovereignty will have to be either established or given away in terms of strategic issues? I mean, is it going to be about Taiwan, for example? Will it be harder for Australia to actually assert itself on a day-to-day basis in the region now that we've made this decision? Well, I think it covers a lot of things. Firstly, in terms of the naval shipbuilding industry, you know, the big idea of having a continuous naval shipbuilding industry, of which the subs were the biggest part, that has obviously gone into a hiatus. You know, gone into just a void, really. There are over 600 subcontractors to Naval Group and to that project that have all had their contracts terminated. Some of them were signed up by Naval Group as part of their commitment to get to 60% Australian content in the week of the dumping by text sent to the Elysee Palace. So look, there are going to be a lot of Australian businesses that are going to, you know, they'll lose a contract, investment will be compromised, jobs will be lost, expertise will lost. I mean, it will be 10 years, is the best estimate I have, at least 10 years, assuming we go down the AUKUS route, before we would actually be able to start building a new submarine. 10 years. Now, that's a long time. In terms of the region, look, the way Scott Morrison handled this has definitely damaged us in the region. There's no question about that, and it's largely on the question of trust. You know, I was not able to achieve what I did with the TPP. I couldn't have done that if Shinzo Abe did not trust me. He was, you know, again, I've written about this in my book, he was initially very wary, because going ahead without the United States, what was Trump going to think about that? How would others come along? Shinzo Abe trusted me, right? President Joko Widodo trusted me, and they trusted Australia. So what Morrison has done, and you know, he can blather and people can try to spin it as much as they like. The fact is that this was a big double cross. This was deceitful conduct on any view, acting in bad faith. So that's a real problem for us. I think in terms of nuclear-powered submarines, the anxiety in the region is, oh, is this going to be the beginning of an arms race? You know, is everyone going to want one? If they're nuclear-powered, when does somebody break out and get nuclear weapons? And just remember, this is why there has always been so much concern about highly enriched uranium. Because if you have highly enriched uranium and you say, oh, everything's good, I'm within the rules, I'm just using it for my submarine fleet here, everyone knows that you can take that highly enriched uranium and make a bomb out of it. I mean, you don't have to enrich it. It actually was originally made for a bomb. So there is a lot of concern about that. But I think the biggest challenge that we're going to have is what this has done to trust. Now, people won't tell you that. No one's going to look Scott Morrison, when the French have done that, but no one's going to look him in the eye and say, I'm not going to trust you anymore. But if you so publicly, and it couldn't be more public than this, make it perfectly obvious that you are not trustworthy, people will attribute that not just to Scott Morrison, but to Australia. And that is what troubles me. I mean, if an Australian Prime Minister is devious or deceitful or untrustworthy in a domestic context, I'm disappointed, as everyone is. But when it happens internationally, it has much graver implications because it tags every single one of us. It tags our country. You know, that is the challenge.
Anthony Galloway.
Thanks for the speech, Mr. Turnbull. Given everything that's happened, given the advice to government seems to be that we need nuclear submarines in terms of stealth and endurance in what we may perhaps have to do in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, do you regret not committing to nuclear-powered submarines, perhaps with the French back in 2016 and committing to developing a nuclear industry in order to do that, given that we've lost 5 years here?
Well, look, Anthony, in an ideal world, you'd always say, yes, it would have been better if, the decisions that are being made today were made 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But the situation we had was that we had, an array of expertise saying you can't have nuclear-powered submarines without a nuclear industry. I might say you can't just buy a nuclear industry. I mean, you can't just go and buy a nuclear industry. You're talking about to make a decision to create the industrial facilities that would support a nuclear navy. That will take, 10, 15, 20 years to bring to fulfilment. I mean, we're literally at a standing start. So, we shouldn't kid ourselves about the nature of the decision that has been taken. And this is why I think it was just so wrong not to be honest and open with the French, because we could have said to the French, you have nuclear submarines, we've asked you to put conventional propulsion in them, how about we move to nuclear power? What would that involve? How long would it take? How would we do it? And then, having worked out a plan and obviously consulted the Americans were all over our submarine choice, by the way. I mean, there are American admirals everywhere. Having done that, you're then in a position to go to the Australian people and say, we do need to have a nuclear navy. It obviously should be sovereign. It's going to take quite a long time to put it in place, but this is where we're heading. In the meantime, we'll have some new conventional submarines, but we'll be using low-enriched uranium, which is, it's not something to play around with, but it is certainly a lot less dangerous from every respect, safety and non-proliferation, than highly enriched uranium, which, as I said, is only used in naval reactors by the US and the UK, and the UK uses American technology, and Russia, and they're all long-standing nuclear powers, nuclear weapon states with, huge nuclear, expertise and experience.
Kim Bergman.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. The submarine program really has been cursed for a long time with multiple changes of direction. Do you think it's possible that France, even if we begged, would come back in with yet another change of direction?
Look, I don't know. I think it certainly would be worth trying, Kim. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that Washington has been embarrassed by the sort of blundering, deceitful way Scott Morrison handled this. I mean, I quoted from Biden's and Macron's statement, and there have been franker observations made privately. But look, yes, it's very hard to, unscramble the omelette, right? But I think that would certainly be that is a discussion that I would be worth trying. It may be that it's too late. The damage has been enormous because, you see, there's so much trust in it because you know, France was entrusting us. This was a government-to-government, a nation-to-nation partnership. They were entrusting us with some of their most sensitive military secrets, the design of their latest submarine. Having behaved in with such bad faith, I think there'd be some hesitation about coming back into business, into partnership with Australia. But look, it may be a new government could do that. That's a possibility, you know. But I think Mr. Morrison, both by his own character, he's not inclined to apologise or admit fault or flaw. But you know, maybe a new government could do that, but it'd be quite hard, I think.
Henry Bello.
Thanks, Mr. Turnbull. Henry Bello from the ABC. There are US media reports that when you were Prime Minister in 2017, the CIA were plotting to either kidnap or potentially assassinate Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy. Were you aware of any such discussions or plots? And what was your reaction either back then or now when you read those reports?
Well, it was really hard to hear you, but I think the question is about what did I know about these allegations of a plot to assassinate Julian Assange, and the answer is absolutely nothing. I don't know whether the reports are accurate, credible, but certainly the first I heard of that was when they were published, which I think was yesterday, wasn't it, or the day before?
The next question is from Pablo Vinales. Pablo, just you're on mute.
Pablo, you're muted.
Apologies. Mr. Turnbull, thank you so much. Pablo Vinales, SBS World News. I just wanted to get your view on COP26. In your view, is there any reason why the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, should not be going? And what message do you think it would send to the world if we didn't have that representation from the country's leader?
Well, Pablo, history is made by those who turn up. So if Mr. Morrison decides not to go to Glasgow, he's sending a message. His absence will send a pretty strong message about his priorities. This is a critical conference. You know, we are, as Antonio Guterres said, the UN Secretary General just the other day, we're on track to 2.7% warming or heating. You know, that's catastrophic. The commitments to reduce emissions so far received are inadequate. Again, this is a crisis. You know, we need to both lead by example. We need to lead by example. We need to make much stronger cuts to our emissions. We should be updating our 2030 target. That was always the intention, to update these targets every 5 years, and I'm very disappointed the government has not done that, although I note the commitment of the New South Wales government for a larger cut in emissions by 2030. And really, it's, you know, this is, look, we've had this discussion so many times, including when I've been at the National Press Club. I mean, this is an existential crisis, and we have to cut our emissions. We have to stop burning coal and gas. I mean, it troubles me that we still have this nonsense from the government of a gas-led recovery. We've got to be getting out of coal and out of gas. And you've got ministers saying we're going to be burning coal forever. Well, you know what? If we burn coal forever, the planet's going to be fried. I mean, at some point, the reality of the physics of global warming and the responsibility that we have for this, you know, mankind, this planet, and all the nature on it, and the future, at some point that responsibility has to come sheet home. And, you know, the crazy thing is that here in Australia, now more than ever, we can move to zero emission energy very quickly. You know, you've got to plan it and so forth. You've got to get cracking with the right infrastructure like Snowy Hydro 2.0, you know, to make renewables reliable. But you're not going to get there with, you know, building new gas-fired power stations, which seems to be Mr. Morrison and Mr. Taylor's only energy project at the moment.
If I could just have a quick follow-up on that, Mr Turnbull, what do you think our 2030 target should be? Is the New South Wales one sufficient to be adopted nationally, or do you think we should be going even further?
Well, there are plenty of scientists that will say it should be as high as 70%, but cut. But certainly it should be at least 50%. 45, 50%. That is actually very doable, and it's done essentially by an earlier retirement of coal-fired generation, and it will require more long-term storage. I mean, I'm a co-chair of a forum on pumped storage with the Assistant Secretary of Energy in the United States. It's a forum between the International Hydropower Association, of which I'm a director, and the US Department of Energy. Now, one of the things that we're talking about is what I've been calling the crisis within the crisis. We've got the climate crisis, but the crisis within that is that we are not building enough long-duration storage, and given the best form of that for, long-duration storage as opposed to short duration, like batteries and so forth, is pumped hydro. You've got to get cracking with it, because you can build you've heard me say this before, all of you, I'm sorry for repeating myself, but you can build a solar farm, in months, you can build a wind farm in a year or so, but to build a pumped hydro scheme takes time because of the civil engineering, the permitting, every site is different. But you've just got to get cracking with it, because otherwise you run the risk that you get all of the you get this great increase in variable renewable energy, wind and solar mostly, but you can't back it up when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. So it's not rocket science, but it does require people to get on with it. So I'm disappointed that the transmission for Snowy Hydro 2.0 is not already under construction. I'm disappointed that Battery of the Nation, the scheme with Tasmania, is not being built yet. I mean, these were things I announced in 2017. Thankfully, I'd got Snowy Hydro 2.0 too far ahead for my successors to put the brakes on. So that at least is being built, but we need a lot more of it.
Matt Coughlin.
Matt Coughlin from Australian Associated Press. Thanks a lot, Mr Turnbull. I just wanted to change tack slightly and ask you about Indigenous affairs. The vaccine rollout's become yet another metric where First Nations people lag behind the rest of the population, joining incarceration rates and other health outcomes. What would you have done differently in the Indigenous vaccination rollout? What needs to be done now? And on a related note, do you still see an Indigenous voice to Parliament as a third chamber? And what's your view on progress in that space since you've left politics?
Well, my views on the second part of the question have not changed, so let me deal with the vaccines. The first thing I would have done is buy enough vaccines. I mean, the reason we're in lockdown is because the federal government did not buy enough vaccines last year. There's no argument about that. It's the biggest failure of public administration I've ever witnessed. So it would have been so easy to buy the Pfizer that was being offered and Moderna and so forth. So if we'd had enough vaccines, we could have had high levels of vaccination many months ago. As far as Indigenous communities are concerned, again, this is just another failure of administration. They were obviously obviously and well known to be among the most vulnerable populations. They should have been provided with vaccines at the earliest possible opportunity as a matter of priority. I mean, it is extraordinary that you've got vulnerable communities that are actually lagging behind, the mainstream of the community. The big cities were in Sydney and Melbourne and so forth. So look, it's a failure. It's a failure of administration. This is I'm sure it's not a policy issue. It's just they did not get their act together. They let us down, and they let down Indigenous communities particularly.
Mark Kenny.
Mark Kenny, Mr Turnbull from the Press Club Board and also from ANU. I'm wondering what you made of Nancy Pelosi's thanking of Scott Morrison and Australia for leadership on climate change. And the second one, if I may, just back on the submarines. Do you have any sense from your contact how long it will be before the French take Australia's call? And could you or would you consider playing a role in helping to rebuild that relationship?
Well, as far as France is concerned, that's, that I wouldn't want to speculate on that. And I've always been ready to, assist Australia's relations with other countries. I mean, you may recall after the regrettable announcement about moving the embassy in Israel during the Wentworth by-election, that created some real concerns among majority Muslim countries, including Indonesia. I went to Indonesia at Scott Morrison's request and helped, smooth that over and contextualise it and so forth. But look, Mr. Morrison is as he conceded himself, incredibly skillful in all of these matters. So I'm sure he will. He'll be confident of his ability to deal with it. But look, just generally, I think it's. I mean, obviously, relations. Ambassadors will return. Things will at the surface get back to normal, but the trust is gone. That's the thing you can't get around. We hear a lot from politicians about values, but I tell you, trust, telling the truth, being consistent and reliable, those are important values, vital values, and the reputation for being trustworthy has been a great national asset for Australia, part of our national security armoury. I mean, Joe Biden talked about this at the United Nations when he said there's going to be more diplomacy, and less military. This is critical. So this was a shocking error in the way the, blowing up the deal with France, the partnership with France was done, and not just to France. There's been a lot of very immature, unreflective commentary on this, saying, "Oh, what a clever wheeze! How smart they were to trick the French, and how brilliantly sneaky." I mean, you're playing for keeps in international affairs, and throwing your reputation for being trustworthy away is a terrible, terrible mistake.
The final question is from Tim Shaw.
Mr. Turnbull, Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. Since 2013, Australia has had 7 science ministers. We've been told as a population, trust the medical science. As chairman of Fortescue Future Industries, can you speak directly to Australia's science and research institutions about what they should do for John? And will FFI be investing with Australian science technologists to retain as much of that brains trust going forward in Australia?
Well, Andrew Forrest, as you know, is a scientist. I mean, he is a Dr. Forrest. He has a PhD in marine science, marine biology. So he is passionately committed to the role of green hydrogen in the transition to a net zero, and as soon as possible. And right at the heart of that mission, both FFI's and Andrew's, is Australian science. So you can be rest assured that FFI's mission is all about science and supporting science. And look, that's, no one could... I used to get criticised as PM for talking too much about innovation and science. I make no apologies for it, but we need it more now than ever.
Mr. Turnbull, thanks so much. If I could just ask you one last question, which is, you've talked about your business involvement in clean energies and things. These big conferences, like the one in Glasgow, obviously have sort of attached conferences of business communities. Are you going to go to Glasgow?
Yes, I am. I'll be going to Glasgow and I'll be speaking there and with as many people as I can, I hope. With FFI and with the Green Hydrogen Organisation, which Dr. Forrest is a founder of and I'm the chairman of, which is an organisation pledged to make the case that the only hydrogen we should be focused on is green hydrogen. That's to say hydrogen made by using renewable energy to electrolyse water to produce hydrogen and oxygen. I'll be in that capacity, and also, of course, as a director of the International Hydropower Association, I've got quite a few things to do with them. I mean, we are very, we are doing everything we can to draw policymakers' attention to this crisis within the crisis. That is to say, the inadequacy of long duration storage to back up all of the variable renewables that are being built out. Yes, so COVID, emergencies, etc., notwithstanding, I expect to be in Glasgow.
Well, thanks for your address today, and I'd like to thank the various Press Club members who've also zoomed in for questions, and that's where we leave our address for today. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much.